Hello and welcome to Scientists Warning TV. And today I'm very pleased to have with me three scientists who recently authored what's proven to be a fairly controversial article in which they call for a moratorium on research, climate research by climate scientists. So just to introduce my three participants today, so I'm very pleased to welcome Bruce Glavovic, who's a professor at Massey University, Iain White, Professor of Environmental Planning at the University of Waikato, and Tim Smith, Professor and ARC Future Fellow at the University of the Sunshine Coast. So thank you and welcome. So I think obviously you're down under, so I appreciate that it's evening with you and early morning here with me in Cambridge. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you. Thanks, Alison.
So I'd just like to pick up on, the main theme of your paper, the main argument that you make, which is that in a sense, you're arguing that the contract between science and society is broken and that really there's little other option but to the scientists now to call for a moratorium on climate change research until governments take action. And I'd just like to start by asking each of you about your motivations for making what's proven to be quite controversial and obviously a very radical call. So Bruce, if I could perhaps start with you.
Sure. Really, the genesis goes back to the three of us getting together to explore possibilities for collaborative research together. And we've independently and in various groupings worked with communities trying to make a difference as they face various challenges, many of which are compounded by climate change, and got to the realization that really, what difference would we make in the long term by just continuing to do kind of science as usual. And by science as usual, I don't mean frivolous or non-helpful work. It's working with communities to try and make a difference. But if the climate is going to continue to cause the devastating impacts that are being experienced already in some places and getting worse, then our work could be for naught. And we got to this place where we reflected on the tragedy of climate change research being the tragedy that we feel compelled to continue doing this work with the best intentions, despite the adverse indicators continuing to rise, despite having decades of knowledge about the predicament that we're in. So we shifted the focus from trying to develop a collaborative research project to focusing on writing a paper that tries to galvanize attention and focus the minds of climate scientists to get introspective about how we go about our work and what influence we're having on the science-society contract.
Yes, and it's interesting because you must have been talking about this and preparing the article before the recent Glasgow COP, and then of course it appeared in the conversation in January. So yes, I mean the frustration of simply, 26 COPs. I mean, it says it all really. We shouldn't be in this position clearly. Iain, if I could move to you and ask you, for you to say something about your motivations for writing this article.
Well, I think some of our motivations were, similar. It was a sense of frustration. We've been working in this field for literally decades. It's the kind of problem which, I don't know, perhaps naively when I was young, I thought would be fixed by now. But you look at the data and, the emissions go up year on year. The emissions curve just hasn't bent. And there was a really good article at the end of last year, which sort of in Nature, which didn't seem to create much fuss, but isn't it 6 out of 10 IPCC authors that were surveyed expected 3 degrees, at least 3 degrees by the end of the century. So I actually don't think the paper is as controversial as its position, because a lot of people think that there's not enough political action. There's a lot of common ground here. And then you start to think about, well, why is that? And there's been a lot of focus on trying to understand that from a scientific perspective. So, I mean, there was a really good article you sent over, which we'd already seen around why haven't we bent the emission curves after 3 decades, and it frames it as a scientific problem. As we need to understand more research around the power of economic models. And I think a lot of it to us felt that the science was enough. We had enough knowledge to act, and it was clear that the knowledge that we created hadn't been acted on. And that was the real, one of the real points for us is, would more knowledge going into this already mountainous knowledge we've created over the last 3 decades, would a little bit more help? Or is it time to do something that's a little bit more radical and activist to try and essentially bring a new way of bringing attention to an existing problem? So it is a new paper, but the way I think about it, this could have been written in any time in the last 2 decades. There's been inaction and we've known about it. It's just a new lens to put on an existing problem. And that's why we hope the focus goes towards political inaction rather than the tools which we might get there.
Yes, that's interesting, and but I'm glad you've mentioned the paper by Isaac Stoddard and Kerry Facer and co, because I think it's very important. But for me, it's astonishing that that more scientists aren't really screaming from the rooftops and just demanding action. And so I personally, and I'm sure the activist community, welcome more scientists like you speaking out and sort of throwing your hands up in the air and saying, well, what can we do? Tim, if I could turn to you now and perhaps just ask you about your motivations for getting involved in writing this paper.
Thanks, Alison. Look, I mean, just to reiterate what Bruce and Iain have said, I think we share the same frustrations. I think the point that I want to make is that we have been working with very committed local actors for decades, and we all operate largely at the local scale, where we work with grassroots communities, local governments, and so on, who are very committed to responding to these issues, both from an adaptation and a mitigation perspective. But, I guess time after time, we see those efforts being stymied by broader forces. And, and we see the situations that they're having to adapt to get worse and worse. And the place where we wrote the paper is a really good example of that. A small coastal community, a few thousand people, that have very limited resources, and their livelihoods are going to be affected. And it's not only livelihoods, it's ecosystems. It's, as we know, it's life on the planet. And I think it's really this, that we know that there's so much literature on what the problems are. So we thought, well, let's critically examine the pathways forward. What options have we got? And that's really the basis of the paper, and where we came up with the idea of a moratorium. We just really would love someone else to come up with an alternative. That would be excellent, and would really like to turn the debate in that direction. If you don't agree with us, that's completely fine, but what's a viable alternative? And we've had people respond to us with throwaway lines like, you just need to build partnerships between communities, business, governments. And we've heard this, and we've been trying to do this for decades, and that hasn't worked either. We've shown that activism hasn't worked. We've shown that more science knowledge hasn't worked. So what are the viable pathways forward? And that's really the motivation for the paper.
Yes, and I think, one of the things that I find very compelling when I talk with climate scientists and scientists and academics working in the space is when the emotionality comes through. Because I feel in some ways that when scientists actually describe what's happening and they talk about the fact, that we might be on a trajectory, we probably are on a trajectory for 3 degrees of warming. When it's stated in that sense, it's hard, I think, for the public and for the listener to actually feel what that might actually mean. And if scientists aren't speaking with enormous urgency and showing that they themselves are terrified, then it's hard to then see how the public could then get a sense of just how desperate our situation actually is. So I really do welcome, what you're doing, and I take your point that you feel you've exhausted the possibilities and that we need to try and do something differently. I
wonder if I might just comment in response to that, because I think one of the critical points that we make in the paper, and we use climate change as an exemplar. This is not limited to climate change. We're not naive about how interwoven climate change is with the whole set of intersecting crises that we face now, including loss of biodiversity, including inequity and injustice. And what is spectacular about this predicament is that since the early 90s, governments have systematically sat down with scientists and carefully worked line by line through critical assessment by the leading climate scientists of the world, reviewing the critically important peer-reviewed literature for over 4 decades. So this is not knowledge that resides only in the climate science community. This is knowledge that has been developed under the architecture of the IPCC, facilitated through a forum of interaction between science and policy. And despite that, governments are making decisions in these conference of party meetings that water down what needs to be done. And what is apparent to governments and to science through this evidence over 4 decades is that climate change is not a future problem. It is a present reality, manifest in extreme events and intensification of extremity for many people in many parts of the world. And in many cases, some of the worst affected are the very people who are least able to adapt, and more fundamentally, have contributed least to the drivers of global warming in the first place.
Absolutely.
So, we're not naive about the science policy interface.
Yeah.
We've worked, as Tim was saying, and as Iain was saying, I spent half of my career in government and as a policy advisor, and the other half of my career in science. And so I understand this interface, and there comes a point at which one has to understand what the drivers and incentives for the policy and political community is relative to science, and then say, so what next? And that again comes back to our motivation and to where we think we can contribute. We're not naive to think that politicians are going to take notice of our paper, but we do think the climate science community needs to have this conversation as a community, and as a community to decide en masse what next.
Absolutely.
If I can just add one thing to that, Bruce, I think for me it's a paper about introspection. If I had to pick one word, it was that. And it's to reflect on the past, what we've done, what we've tried, and what hasn't worked. And just to pause, to take a moment to pause before we just rush headlong into the next round of assessment reports, to think about if there's anything we can do in the short time that's remaining to actually elevate this problem and to escalate it, and to try and disrupt science as usual. So if it does create a pause or a need for introspection against some scientists, then that for us is a good outcome. It's not necessarily trying to achieve any particular option. It's to try and think through that, look, we have tried a huge amount. And I use the argument that I think what climate science has done is probably the most successful collective scientific endeavor in human history. This is not a critique of climate science or scientists in any way whatsoever. It's been a huge success. What they've done from the late 80s to now, the way they've come together as a community to generate the required knowledge, more than the required knowledge. And that just stands in contrast to the abject policy failure that we've seen. And I think if we can put attention to why there is that success in failure next to each other, then that's a good thing.
Absolutely. And I want to say something perhaps a little controversial here. On the one hand, I agree with you that the scientists have, you guys have diligently done your job. You've generated the requisite knowledge. At the same time, though, I'm reminded of something that Julia Steenberger, the ecological economist, has said, which is that the problem isn't so much that that politicians don't understand the science. They do. It's rather that scientists have failed to understand politics and how politics works. And it's a cutting remark. Tim, if I could turn to you now for a reflection on the article. So I think it's very interesting that Iain, that you say that you've written it not because you expect you expect people, the politicians, to care about the fact that you're calling for a moratorium on climate research. So I think, in a sense, what you've done there is address a criticism, which is, well, so what? Climate scientists decide not to do this. So I think it's a very good point you make that the article has been written to prompt climate scientists and the wider academic community to introspect on your endeavours, and the fact that there is this that the contract between science and society is broken. Tim, could I wonder if you might like to comment there?
Look, I'll just say two things. The first one is that I think I don't think scientists are naive about the political process, and there's actually been a lot published on this by the social scientists, for instance, and I don't think there's naivety on biophysical scientists either. And I think that's what we've showed in the paper, that scientists have actually been activists. There's a long history of science being activists, about science getting involved in the political process, about changing careers and going into being policy advisors and shifting careers. You yourself have shifted careers, and we've seen other people doing the same thing. So I don't really agree with that point that scientists don't understand the political process. I think the point of our paper is we've tried everything. Nothing has worked. What's an alternative approach? And, in terms of the science society contract, there's been other people, and you mentioned this to us before the podcast, that some people have said, it's really just a matter of, scientists getting money to do something, we do it, and then that's the end of the contract. And that again is just a total misunderstanding that science is such a value-laden process. Well, are we going to go out and research things that we know are going to be detrimental to society and the planet? Of course not. So that again is a very naive view. That there's been a lot written about the science society contract, and I think we've shown quite clearly in the paper that it is fundamentally broken, and that we really need to think about how do we actually renegotiate this? So I think that's really what we're trying to get to at the paper. What's our role as scientists in trying to renegotiate this science society contract?
Absolutely, and I think you're right. I think the conversations that need to be held within the community are going to be difficult conversations, and I would also agree that I don't think it's helpful to point the finger of blame at climate scientists on the one hand, or another group of academics, but equally, we've had 26 COPs centred on climate, and there have been 15 centred on biodiversity. And it is perhaps a fair comment to say that, for us to have gone through this 26 times does suggest that there's some learnings that could have taken place perhaps at an earlier point. And I say that not to critique you or others in the community, but simply to say that enough is enough. It really is time now for the community to engage in the kinds of conversations that you're inviting people to engage in. And I think there probably would be a broad consensus around the point you made, that simply doing the same thing again and again isn't going to change things. It's been said that winning slowly in the context of our current predicament is the same as losing. These sort of incremental changes are not getting us anywhere near to where we need to be. And I understand that you get that. But one thing I'd like to explore with you, and this is perhaps the last area to touch on, is that you said in your paper, you argue that the only course of action now is for you to call for a moratorium on climate research. And you're very clear that it's not all climate research. It's climate research where the issues are in a sense resolved, and that the science is settled. And you talk about advocacy as not being a viable way forward, but you say rather less about activism. And of course, as someone who's an activist herself, and I work directly with some activists, who lay their freedom on the line, to try to bring about change. And I'd like to explore with you why you feel activism might not be a viable way forward.
I think
maybe I'll kick off.
So when you start, Bruce.
I'll kick off just a couple of observations. I think that really what we're saying is that at least one of the most prominent sort of globally recognized interventions was James Hansen's testimony to Congress and consequences that followed from that. And there's just a litany of activist interventions that we can applaud and be glad that is happening, with scientists joining many other civil society activists and others. But it hasn't brought about a change in the way those 26 Conference of Party meetings have gone about their business or the conclusions they've reached. So we're running out of time. I mean, it's as simple as that. We're running out of time because we are moving. And if people don't get it yet, when we live in a world that's 3 degrees or more of warming, that is a dangerous world for humanity and for the ecosystems we depend on. So we're running out of time. So I think activism is absolutely necessary. Civil disobedience, we need to get political attention. The question that we're posing is, what is the role of the science community now? And perhaps the most potent provocation is not a single paper that, a bunch of people down in Australia and New Zealand wrote, but rather if a critical mass of the climate science communities agreed, we're not going to support another round of assessment by the IPCC that will take another 6 or 7 years to come up with yet another report that will fine-tune what is already stated in AR6. And we've lost another decade. So we think that by putting a halt to that process, for example, would send an incredibly powerful signal, not only to politicians, but to the entire world that's looking on at these issues.
There's a couple of things I'd just add to that. And in many ways, this is another form of activism. It's a new front of activism that perhaps we haven't opened or explored too much today. And that's how I tend to think about it. I mean, a really good example about activism is social media. When we started our careers, it didn't even exist. If we wanted to influence the press, we put out a press release once a year or something of that nature. Now it's a daily occurrence for many, many academics around the world being activists on social media to try and influence. And they've done that for some time now. And yet emissions still go up. And so we're not ruling anything out. But really, we're inviting a conversation that this is some options that we think could happen. If you don't agree with these, then you tell us your options, because the policy response so far just has not been at the pace and scale required. And if you agree with that, then what do you suggest? And this is another form of activism, and it is the way a bit of a thought experiment. If scientists normally respond to funding calls from government, and we apply, we put proposals together, and we find out if we're successful or not. What would be the situation this time if the science community told government that we don't think another AR7 is necessary on some of the fundamentals of climate science because that's been sold? Would that have a strong political reaction than perhaps another assessment report? So thinking through options about how we can disrupt not just business as usual, but science as usual.
I think you're right, because Bruce, as you were speaking there, I was saying to myself, what you're arguing for does sound like a particular kind of activism, and so I don't see a divide between scientists and activists, and indeed many people are calling for scientists and academics to become more disruptive and to embrace activism. And some would go further, and I do have some sympathy with the argument that that it is incumbent upon us as academics, because we're creating knowledge, we're generating new knowledge, and with that comes a big responsibility. And so because we recognize that contract between science and society is broken, it's incumbent upon us to do something. It's just the what, what is it that we can do? Tim, if I could pass to you for some reflections on that point, please.
Oh, look! I agree, and I think you made the point before that there's been amazing, excellent, high-quality science that's been done, and there is so much more that we can contribute to. And so I think we're certainly not disputing that. We're not saying that this is the end of science, so we don't need to keep doing science. It's exactly what you've suggested, that this is a form of activism, that we really need to change things quickly. I think Bruce made the point that we don't have time to wait for another assessment report in the vague hope that there's going to be some fundamental changes. As you've said, we're seeing 26 COPs. What's going to happen? What's going to be different? We're all doing this because we feel very strongly about the health of the planet and society. We're not merchant bankers. We're really wanting to make a difference. I think the vast majority of the science community would have a similar perspective. That we all care about the planet. We only have one planet. There is no substitute. We need radical, urgent action. And so we got to this point, and that's the whole motivation for the paper. What are our options? And we would love someone else to come up with another viable option, as I said. We just can't see any other alternative pathways forward. Yeah,
okay. I'd like to now ask you about the reactions that you've had to the paper. So you've put out a call. It's basically a call to arms. Have people approached you and said, yes, we realise we need to do something? Have people approached you and said that's a daft idea? And what next? What next if we're going to take this forward and try to bring about the transformative change that we so urgently need? So what next?
I can kick off again, and then we can build on each other. It'd probably be tempting to want to come back in on it. The response on the Twitter feeds is beyond anything we expected. It's not common for a sort of technical piece to end up getting attention in Twitter in the way it did. A lot of hate and a lot of love, put in the most non-scientific of terms. But included in amongst that are some heavyweight climate scientists who are very disparaging and very critical and making observations, that this is absurd that this is published and so on. But at the same time, some very notable climate scientists saying, this is an important issue that we need to deal with seriously and to pay attention to it. There have also been comments by many non-climate scientists. We've deliberately chosen not to engage in a Twitter battle, but we are very keen to try and do what we set out to do, which was to spark conversation and introspection amongst the climate science community. And to do that, this kind of conversation we think is very important, so that there's considered reflection on what we're talking about. And the people that we're engaging with have actually read the article, because many have admitted that they haven't even read the article. They've just responded to the headline. And really from here, it is about trying to spark that conversation. And we anticipate that there will be scholarly reactions where people will write, a more reflective and deeper response that'll give us opportunity to debate this. But again, we don't want to just have this as a philosophical conversation. We want to see it translated into action.
Great. I think that's a very important point. And I think you're right. Looking at some of the comments on Twitter, I think it's clear that your intentions were misconstrued, which is really unfortunate. And it's clear that there were some knee-jerk reactions, I think, from the community. Iain, could I move to you to comment?
Yeah, I think social media is not the right forum for this kind of debate. It's too nuanced. It's too emotional. It just doesn't lend itself to that kind of platform. I think we all received, private messages which were very supportive, and a lot of And I got messages which were really welcome, but it's not. Some of the response, I think, was thank you for saying things like this. And some of the response was we completely disagree. And I think to our mind, that's fine. To completely disagree is fine, but just tell us what you think. Because if you think that we haven't acted quick enough, then we want to hear your ideas about what our options are, because there's not an awful lot of time. And that's why I say the paper really, the headlines got grabbed for one of the options, but really it's a paper about introspection of 3 decades of a lack of political progress. And I think the other thing to point out was most of the response was by climate scientists, but it was really, it's aimed at politicians. We're saying that climate science they've done a fantastic job. They've done everything that's asked for. What now? And we want to see more response from politicians as well as the climate science community, because that's who we're trying to put under the spotlight.
Yeah, and of course that's the question: how to get their attention, because thus far they've evaded criticism and judgment. Tim, if I could pass to you for just a final comment before we wrap up on this.
Look, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Bruce and Iain. I think, it's very difficult to have nuanced, complex conversations through social media, and it was really disappointing that some people that commented didn't read the paper or really understand the core message. And it's easy to take things out of context, and but I think the fundamental thing is that we reiterate that we understand that there's been amazing science and there's amazing science still to contribute. But obviously people see a media headline or something, and all of a sudden, it's people are very passionate about this issue and passionate about their careers and passionate about the contributions that they've made, and it's easy to personalize these things as an attack on an individual and yourself and your sense of who I am, and I think some of the responses seem to have been driven by a knee-jerk perspective on that, instead of we're saying that's not what the message is at all. The message is really about how can we as a scientific community have the impact that we know is required, and that's the bottom line, so we recognize the amazing things that have happened, but what is the viable course of action? What should we be doing as a community? And that's really the discussion that we need to have. It's a critical discussion. Time is running out. We need to be having these very hard conversations now. We said in the paper it's going to be very unpalatable, but we think that the other options are untenable. So we need to have their discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you put the point incredibly well, I think. I mean, for me, it isn't just about climate science. For me, the question is around the whole of the academic endeavour. Is academia fit for future purpose? And for me, the answer is a resounding no. It absolutely isn't, because it's arguably perpetuating the current crisis because of the way in which it's configured, because academia is essentially a business, operating according to various business models. And that's a separate conversation. Personally, I welcome what you're doing. I think it is unfortunate that some of your intentions have been misconstrued. I think it's super, super important that academics, that scientists like yourselves have that conversation. And, I personally really look forward to hearing more from you, to finding out about what you go on to do next. And I just want to thank you for what you're doing and thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks very much, Alison.
Thanks for your interest.